Hello and welcome to this presentation on Marie Antoinette. In preparing for this, I read two books. I read Marie Antoinette, Portrait of an Average Woman, written by Stephen Zweig, and I also read Louis and Antoinette, written by Vincent Cronin. I've lent out both copies of the book, so I don't have them to show, but I'll leave the titles under the event description. This is not an attempt to launder the reputation of Marie Antoinette, but just give a fair representation of her life story. And I will not focus too much on the French Revolution, just to expedite things. So let's talk about Marie Antoinette. She was a Habsburg princess. Their family motto was Belligerant Ali to Felix Austria Nube, translated as let others wage war, thou happy Austria marry. And the Habsburg did. They got married off a lot all over Europe in peace treaties. Marie Antoinette's mother had 16 children. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so that's a family portrait. So Marie's early life. Her full name was Maria Antonia Josepha Joanna von Osterich-Lothringen. She was born on November 2nd, 1755, at the Kaiserhof, the palace, the Hofburg Palace, which was the seat of power for the Habsburg dynasty. And that's a picture of her from her infancy. And so she was born an archduchess. These are some titles of royalty. So that's her mom was an empress. She was born an archduchess. So her father was the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I of Lorraine. He was a Frenchman. That's a portrait of her dad. And her mom was the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. There she is. Her mother ruled over an empire which today includes Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Croatia. Marie was number 15 out of 16 children. She grew up in Vienna, and she grew up with a level of wealth and luxury that is impossible to describe. And she was a daddy's pet. Now I'm going to share a video clip that will give a little background of what her upbringing may have been like, because psychologists tell us that our characters are fully formed by the time we're 7 years old. And so let's see the kind of household that Marie Antoinette grew up in. And that is just the Winter Palace. That's just one of her childhood homes. There was also the Summer Palace, which was at Schönbrunn Palace, which has 1,441 rooms. And for Marie Antoinette, this was ordinary. As ordinary as your home feels to you. That's how these palaces felt to her. And she grew up with thousands of servants. She never had to do chores, just had to play music, embroider, dance, walk properly, and do her deportment, study history, French, German, Latin, all those kinds of things. She was raised by a governess. Her mother was too busy running an empire. There was very relaxed etiquette at the palaces she grew up in. Marie was extremely charming, even as a little girl, and she had her governess and all her tutors wrapped around her little fingers, and so she persuaded them to let her play rather than study, and they obliged. So her character was fully formed by these years, right? She never read an entire book her whole life, never finished reading one book her entire life. She lived for pleasure and amusement. She got everything she wanted. She always got everything she wanted. She hated any serious topics, and her eyes would glaze over if anyone started discussing anything too serious. With Marie, if you wanted her to learn anything, then you had to make it entertaining. And she was actually a very bright person, but she was reluctant to apply herself because she never needed to. Later in life, almost all the statesmen she met said the same thing about her. That she was really brilliant, but she just didn't apply herself. She lacked ambition because what did she need ambition for? She was daddy's little girl, and her father died when she was just 9 years old. Broke her. Abby Vermont, her tutor when she was 12 years old, says this about her, quote, "She is more intelligent than has been generally supposed. Unfortunately, up to age 12, she has not been trained to concentrate in any way. Since she's rather lazy and extremely frivolous, she's hard to teach." End quote. Even though her father was French, she barely spoke any French. She didn't know how to read or write in French or German. She knew nothing about French culture or French etiquette. The etiquette at home in Vienna was very relaxed. It was very a laid-back environment they grew up in. Part of her dancing as a child. They're a very close-knit family, so a very relaxed etiquette at home. And meanwhile, her mother and King Louis XV of France had been negotiating their marriage for years. In 1748, a peace treaty had been signed between France and Austria to end a war that had lasted 150 years. And as part of that agreement, one of the Empress's daughters was going to have to marry the Dauphin of France as the heir to the French throne. Some of Marie Antoinette's older sisters had died from smallpox, and one was very badly scarred. And so all of her older sisters, there wasn't any that was available. And so Marie was chosen when she was 11 years old to marry the Dauphin of France. In 1769, when she was about 13, 14 years old, that was when the King of France formally demanded Marie Antoinette for his grandson, the Dauphin. And he was only a year older than Marie Antoinette. And so it was at this time that Marie Antoinette's mom, the Empress, discovered that her daughter had been playing truant. And that's when she discovered just how ignorant Marie really was. And so began the crash course in French language and elocution, dance, history, and etiquette, because the wedding had been set for 1770. And so this immature, shallow teenager was expected to suddenly learn all this within a matter of months because her wedding was set for the following year, right? And so she got special tutors. Her mother even took her on pilgrimage to Mariazell in Austria. It was too late. Empress Maria Theresa was terrified to send Marie to France. She wrote down a list of rules and regulations and made Marie Antoinette swear to read them once every month. She sent a private letter to King Louis XV begging him to understand that Mary was only 14 and to bear with her. And so while everyone else was rejoicing, her mom was reportedly uh, going to church to beg God to prevent a disaster. She knew her daughter. And so 1770 came around and it was time for Marie's weddings. So both kingdoms tried to outdo each other in the lead up to the wedding. King Louis XV had two luxury carriages specially built in Paris, which were going to be sent to Vienna to pick Marie up. They were built from rare woods. They were coated with glass, lined with satin, lavishly adorned with gold crowns and precious stones and beautiful paintings on the inside. The first wedding ceremony was done by proxy and took place in Vienna because Marie's fiance was in France, obviously. And so her brother stood in for him. And this took place on April 19th, 1770 at the Augustinian Church in Vienna. She renounced all her Austrian rights, and there was a full military review. There were various parties and balls and receptions all over Vienna for days and days. Her mother went all out, bought all the best silks, diamonds, golds, pearls, and so on. And so it was after this first wedding by proxy that she was going to leave for France. The two luxury carriages arrived. Each one was pulled by 6 horses. Equestrians call this six in hand. Her carriages were accompanied by 48 other carriages. Each was also pulled by 6 horses. When she was leaving Austria, she was accompanied by knights, maids of honor, foot soldiers, laundresses, doctors, cavalrymen, priests, secretaries, and 117 bodyguards. In total, there were 340 horses. And at various cities all along the way, there were 340 horses stationed so that they could get switched, so that the horses didn't get exhausted. And at each stop, when they stopped to get fresh horses, there were more celebrations and receptions at all those towns. And so here's this 14-year-old girl who hasn't even left Austrian soil yet. And then there's this huge fuss done, at her wedding. If you were 14 years old and this kind of fuss was made about you, how do you start to think of yourself? So she left Vienna on April 21st, 1770. And then she got to the border between France and Germany for the official handover ceremony on May 7th. So there was a small island between both kingdoms, and this was seen as neutral ground. So a better place for the hand of ceremony. A special building had been constructed for the occasion. And so the idea was that Mary would go in through one door as an Archduchess of Austria, and she was going to leave everything Austrian behind her. And then she would emerge on the other side as the Dauphiness of France. And so she removed everything she was wearing down to her hairpins, and she left everything behind her. And then she was immediately dressed in French clothes. She broke down and wept. She wasn't even allowed to take her pet dog with her. And so after they dressed her up in French clothes, she walked into the next room where the French delegation was waiting to welcome her onto French soil. She was handed over to the highest ranking French official. The marriage contract was read out loud, and then she walked into France, surrounded by all the bluest blue bloods of the French aristocracy. She broke down and cried again and fell into the arms of her new lady in waiting. And so now the new French convoy rode through various French towns towards the forest of Campion, where Marie Antoinette would meet her in laws and her husband for the first time. She got there, got out of her carriage. She curtsied perfectly to the king, and he kissed both her cheeks. And then he introduced her to her new husband, who also kissed both her cheeks. But he was completely unemotional. He was described as a cold fish. And so all three of them got into the royal carriage, and Marie Antoinette chatted with the king while her husband didn't say a word and he looked bored throughout the carriage ride. Her second wedding took place on May 16th, 1770, at the chapel in Versailles. It was a very private ceremony, and only the bluest of the blue bloods of the French aristocracy were in attendance. Again, a very, very lavish ceremony. Marie Antoinette's wedding gown was dripping with pearls and diamonds and all the works. Her wedding gifts were the jewels that belonged to the late Queen of France. There was a private dinner reception followed by the pair being escorted to their marriage bed by the king and the aristocracy. And so they got into bed. The curtains were closed around them. The priest blessed their marital bed. The king kissed both their foreheads, and then they were left in their bedroom, and that was that. Their wedding night. Nothing happened. Louis, Marie Antoinette's husband, even wrote in his diary that night, well, the day after the wedding, he wrote, Rion, nothing. There are many theories as to why their marriage remained unconsummated for the first 7 years. Some say that it was inexperience, and some say that Louis was impotent. Some say that Marie Antoinette was terrified or she was frigid, but who knows what really happened. This was supposed to be a private matter between both of them, right? Well, wrong. Understand that in an 18th century monarchy, the sex life of the Dauphin of France and his wife were not private matter. The sex life of the heir to the throne was a public matter. Not only was it a public matter, it was a matter of state. Why? Because the institution of monarchy depends on succession. And so the non-consummation was going to have far-reaching consequences. Those first 7 years were extremely humiliating for both of them. And they were mocked. You think people just let them get away with it for 7 years? They were mocked. They were mocked in pamphlets, in pornographic poems, and all sorts of gossip and songs. Everybody from the chambermaids to the stable boys, from the knights to the army officers, everybody was talking about it. Even the other royal houses, other royal families in Europe mocked them. The Spanish ambassador actually paid a chambermaid to monitor and report to him on the state of the royal couple's bed sheets every day. It was really, really bad. And the early years of their marriage were difficult for both of them because they couldn't have been more different. If ever two married people were total opposites, it was Marie Antoinette and Louis. Physically, he was heavy set. She was slim. He was slow and dull. She moved with graceful agility. He was indecisive. Marie always knew exactly what she wanted. He loved to live modestly. She was extravagant. He enjoyed hunting, carpentry, and locksmithing. She enjoyed shopping, parties, dance, and gambling. He was serious. She was light-hearted. He was a bookworm and had over 8,000 books in his library. Marie had never read an entire book her whole life. He had a healthy appetite. She mostly liked chocolate. He was a loner. She was a social butterfly. He went to bed at 11 p.m. Her night was just getting started. She was a party animal. They may have occupied the same bed, but they lived completely separate lives. And yet, strangely, they had a very peaceful marriage. It had to work for the peace of the realms. And so, how do they cope with all these difficulties? They both overcompensated. For Marie, she shopped. She shopped a lot. And Marie loved trinkets. She loved jewelry. Let me share a video about a sale that took place in Geneva in 2018. So it was a sale of some of Marie's jewels, and the jewels that belong to the Bourbon Parma family.
The Bourbon Parma collection is very, very special. It is very thrilling to put the hands on jewels that were round the neck of Marie Antoinette. I didn't feel the shiver the first time I did it. The Bourbon Parma family were connected with royalty in Spain, France, Italy, and Austria, and amassed jewels of exquisite taste and of huge historic importance. The most antiques of the example in the collection go back to Queen Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette is one of the most memorable queen of all history. So to have something that was created for her and she wore on her skin is something very, very sort of poignant and strong. The highlight of the whole sale is a really gorgeous pearl and diamond pendant set with a large pear-shaped drop mounted on a diamond bow. It is an amazing jewel in itself. The fact that Marie Antoinette wore it in conjunction with 3 strings of pearls that are sold within the collection as well is an extra bonus. The collection includes an absolutely spectacular pair of girandole earrings set with diamonds, and we have hints that some of the stones included in these earrings were from Marie Antoinette collection. And there is a tiny little pocket watch in gold enamel and pearls. She would have worn it on a belt, so something that really sat next to her and she consulted on a regular basis. There are also some very, very personal jewels. There is a fantastic little ring under the monogram MA for Marie Antoinette set with diamonds. There is a lock of Marie Antoinette here. The moment I put it on my finger, I thought, I'm not just looking at history, I'm wearing it. Of course, the collection keeps on growing. Every different generation adds to it. I love particularly a ribbon bow brooch set with a ruby at the center, the bow made of diamonds, a perfect example of the garland style. And then, of course, we have a tiara in the design of 3 huge fleur-de-lis motifs, the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon family. Not a little princess tiara, really, very imposing, very regal. There is a fantastic ring set with a 2.44 carat orangey pink diamond. I love the color, and nowadays fancy colored diamonds are very sought after. Jewels as fashion change and get altered with time. And I think we're really getting into a proper appreciation of the jewels as a form of art that you can wear and easily adapt to contemporary fashion. Jewels really have a history that they want to tell us, and that is a part of my job that I adore.
So the first 3 years when she was in France, she wasn't allowed to visit Paris. She had been asking and asking him, but they wouldn't let her go. And so in 1773, Marie went to the king and personally asked him. So he agreed, and an official date was set, June 8th, 1773. As a side note, after she got the permission of the king, Marie and her husband and his brother actually all snuck into Paris before the 8th of June, but they wore masks and they went to an opera ball. Anyway, so on June 8th, when she was going to have her official visit to Paris, she got into the carriage with her husband and they set off. And she received the reception of a rock star. People lined the streets all along the way, so much so that the carriage couldn't move for about 45 minutes due to the vastness of the crowds. People went crazy for her. Like, imagine what it was like when Princess Diana and Prince Charles first got married and they visited Australia. That's the sort of reception that Marie Antoinette got. And so those first 3 years, she'd been at Versailles, surrounded by aristocrats, right? And they'd all been blasé about her presence. And now she's getting this unrestrained adulation from over 200,000 people. It went straight to her head. She was 18 years old at the time, and her personality changed overnight. Became supremely confident, almost bordering on arrogance. The dragon had been unleashed. From that day on, and for the next 20 years, she went to Paris 2 to 3 times every week, whether it was shopping or parties or mass balls. Mass balls were her favorites because she thought she was going incognito. Everybody knew who she was, but they played along with her. And so she flirted with as many men as she wanted, bought makeup, expensive dresses, jewelry, all those ridiculous hairstyles that she was known for. She was already a spoiled child and she was addicted to pleasure. And around this time, since her husband wasn't giving her much attention, she fell in love with herself. Of course, she deserved all the adulation. Of course, she deserved all the admiration of all the people. And Louis, her husband, he overcompensated by acting extra manly, going hunting even more, and trying to be even more assertive because he didn't feel like a real man. He eventually lost all his self-confidence and became so withdrawn that he even stopped attending any social activities. And this deep sense of shame that he felt made him very timid with Marie Antoinette. He hated how loud and frivolous she was, but he couldn't dare to be assertive with her or reprimand her. And so he went the opposite way and he gave in and gave her everything she wanted. And unfortunately, this set the pattern for the power dynamics that would continue for the rest of their marriage. Because even after he became king and she had children, these were the same power dynamics that they had. And the state of their marriage also set other dangers in motion. Because Marie Antoinette was suspected of having affairs and orgies with everything that moved. And these rumors started around this time and would continue far into the future. And Louis' brothers were both actually happy about the situation because they saw it as an opportunity for them to take the throne. Because if the marriage failed to produce any heirs, then the crown will pass on to them. And so they helped with the rumor spreading. So imagine their anger after 7 years of hard work when she finally gave birth. So now, Marie Antoinette was aware that she was the highest ranking woman in France, and yet she was still a teenager. So it was a confusing time for her. One minute she was being treated like a future queen, and the next minute she was being treated like a child. She was still taking lessons like a schoolgirl, but also expected to behave with the dignity of her title. She was always surrounded by older, serious people, and yet she wanted to be around younger people. And so sometimes she played with her husband's younger brothers. She was once caught sitting on the floor at the palace, playing with the maid's children. She was so lonely. She'd grown up in a very relaxed royal court, and now at Versailles, etiquette was just too confining for her. And she was a bit of a rebel and a tomboy. She even formed her own girl squad among the younger noble ladies. She nicknamed her lady in waiting as Madame Etiquette because she was constantly reminding Marie of what rules she was breaking, even something as simple as a yawn or a giggle. And everything she did was watched, not just by the courtiers, but also by the Austrian ambassador. He had her servants spying on her, and he reported everything she did to her mum. Everything. Everything she wore, everything she said, everything she read. She had zero privacy. Zero. As she said about this, I washed my hands and put on my rouge in front of the whole world. And her mother sent letter after letter, either berating her for something she had done or not done, or advising her. Her mother really wanted the marriage to work. It was imperative that it work. So Marie committed a bit of a diplomatic faux pas because she got involved in palace gossip and she hated Madame du Barry. Madame du Barry was the current king's mistress, and Marie Antoinette would just look through her like she was made of glass. Madame du Barry was a former prostitute, but she was now the de facto queen of France, unofficially, of course. She controlled the king, and so she granted favors and appointments to the nobles. Everybody had to go through her to get what they wanted. Officially, du Barry held no rank, and she could not speak to Marie Antoinette unless Marie spoke to her first. And so Marie took advantage of this and would just completely blank Madame du Barry. It took a lot of work, but Marie was eventually intimidated into talking to Madame du Barry, and it really angered Marie because she felt it was beneath her dignity to talk to this woman. And so it's suspected that Madame du Barry may have played a hand in also spreading rumors about Marie Antoinette, but it's debatable. Can't really tell. All this time, the citizens of France were getting taxed more and more heavily. And the palace rumors were beginning to spread across the country because there were those pamphlets and caricatures of Marie Antoinette amongst everyday people. And she didn't help matters either with her incessant partying and excessive spending. And at a masked ball in 1774, she met a very handsome Swedish count by the name of Axel von Fersen. He flirted quite a bit and developed a close relationship. It's rumored that they may have had an affair. In a letter he wrote to his sister, he said, I have decided never to marry. It would be unnatural. I cannot belong to the one person I truly want. So I prefer to belong to nobody. And Marie, on her part, was often seen with tears in her eyes whenever she was around him. And people noticed that whenever he was in a room, Marie's eyes always followed him everywhere he went. So maybe they had an affair, who knows? But her character assassination started even during those 7 childless years. And she was given many delightful names like L'Autrichienne, the Austrian bitch, the hag, the crown whore, and the Austrian she-wolf. And bear in mind, she wasn't even queen yet. And so Many times during the week, she would ride into her carriage and enter Paris as the people were heading home after a hard day's work. She would stay the night attending parties and gambling all night long. And then when the common folk were heading back to work in the morning around 6 a.m., Marie would be in her carriage heading back to Versailles to sleep. But there was hope that when she became queen, perhaps the responsibility of her new position will dawn on her. And around this time, Versailles was already in decline because by the time Louis XV became king, the most powerful people at Versailles were his mistresses. First was Madame de Pompadour, and after she died, Madame du Barry took over. And so amongst the nobility, the only people who rose to any notable ranks around this time didn't do so based on merit. It was solely based on gaining favor from the king's mistresses. And Marie had made a big mistake by alienating Madame du Barry because she felt that it was beneath her dignity to associate with a mistress and a former prostitute. Madame du Barry could have become a powerful ally to her and would have warned her about their enemies at Versailles, because actually many of the nobles helped to start up the revolution. So let's talk about the beginning of the end. So it started April 27th, 1774. Louis XV returned from a hunt with a thumping headache, and then he went to Le Petit Trianon to visit his mistress, Madame du Barry. The next day, smallpox was discovered on his body. And within a matter of hours, his body began to decompose and to stink whilst he was still alive. He died on the 10th of May, 1774. And within seconds of his death, everybody at Versailles came rushing into the room where the now Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were sitting. Everyone came to kiss the ring of the new king. Now that she was finally becoming queen, she would have as much personal freedom as she wanted. After all, she wore the pants in her marriage, so who was going to challenge her? She was 19 years old and she was Queen of France. So within 2 weeks, she had kicked out Madame du Barry and taken over Le Petit Trianon. The Empress, her mother, was distressed because she knew who her daughter Marie was. And so the Empress wrote to Ambassador Mercy expressing her deep concern. She wrote, quote, "I fear her best days are past." And she also wrote a letter to Marie saying, "I do not compliment you on your new dignity, which is dearly bought, but which will become even more costly if you stop leading the quiet life you have led in the past 3 years." She tried to explain to Marie that being queen was a heavy burden with responsibilities. Told her, learn to interest yourself in serious matters. Warned her to curtail her spending. Meanwhile, the French people were rejoicing after the death of the old king because they believed that life would get better under this new king, this young, simple new king and his charming wife. But Louis XVI was described as cold-blooded as a fish. He was a shy person, but also very phlegmatic. Nothing moved him, nothing. Not pleasure, pain, fear, anxiety, or love. You know, even the night before his execution, he ate well and slept like a baby. He never expressed anger or enthusiasm for anything. He didn't care about music or art or dance or anything. He was uninterested in women, wasn't even interested in Marie Antoinette. He was slow in decision making, and all he really cared about was hunting and locksmithing. And so he was a weak king who became like a puppet to his wife and to his ministers. He didn't really care about being king. It was foisted upon him. So he was good-natured, but he was dull and uninspiring. And the French people had had such high hopes for his reign, and they were very disappointed. And those dashed hopes turned into rage. So their coronation took place on June 11th, 1775, and it happened at the height of a bread shortage. And this is when Marie Antoinette is accused of uttering those infamous deadly words. Let them eat cake. Qu'ils mangent de la brioche. So let's talk about this saying. So it had been attributed to several other people for possibly 30 years before Marie Antoinette was even born. The phrase was first written about by a political philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his autobiography titled Confessions. And at the time he wrote his autobiography, Marie Antoinette was only 10 years old, and she lived in Vienna. And in a letter written by Rousseau, 18 years before Marie Antoinette was even born, he makes a reference to that quote. And this time it is attributed to a certain Spanish princess. The same phrase was even attributed to two of Louis XVI's aunties and to several other aristocratic women before Marie Antoinette ever set foot on French soil. And then there's a letter penned by Marie Antoinette in 1775. In a letter sent to her mother shortly after her coronation, she says, "It is quite certain that in seeing people who treat us so well, despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness." Those sound like the words of somebody who didn't care about the starving people. It had been attributed to others before her, but in her case it stuck because she was so hated. She was also a visible target. She was Austrian and she was a woman. And so she became the scapegoat for the revolution. She was already guilty, no matter what the accusation was, no matter how illogical it was. France was already facing financial difficulties before she ever got there. Versailles was expensive to build and to maintain. The citizens were already being overtaxed. Bread shortages were already happening before she arrived. Louis XV had already blown vast amounts of money on his mistresses, trying to please them. He built Le Petit Trianon for Madame de Pompadour, and it was now occupied by Madame du Barry. So where was all the outrage when he built Le Petit Trianon for his mistress? A mistress? Marie Antoinette was the queen. Anyway, and also during his reign, France funded the American Revolution. Anyway, so now that Marie was queen and she'd taken over Le Petit Trianon, she could enjoy her privacy. Nobody could enter without her permission, and the people were starving. Marie was busy renovating the Petit Trianon, and so resentment at her was reaching a fever pitch. But she seemed to be getting more extravagant as queen. She was accused of being a lesbian, and she was being openly asked by the people, "When will you provide an heir?" And she was also nicknamed Madame Deficit. Her mother warned her in letter after letter about just how vicious the pamphlets were getting. And in a letter to Ambassador Mercy, Marie says, "What does she want? I'm terrified of being bored. Marie wanted the freedoms of being a queen, along with, she wanted the powers of a queen, along with the freedoms of a teenager. It wasn't going to work. In any case, her brother, who was now the emperor, Emperor Joseph II, he came to visit Versailles in 1777. It was the last time that she would ever meet any member of her family. So he had dinner with the couple on the 19th of April. And during his visit, he was somehow able to gain the confidence of Marie's husband, Louis XVI. So he found a way to resolve the issue in their marriage. And so their marriage was finally consummated on August 18th, 1777. So on December 19th, 1778, Marie Antoinette had a very healthy, beautiful baby girl named Maria Therese Charlotte. And next, she finally provided an heir, the Dauphin, Louis Francois. He was born in October of 1781. And then she had another boy, Louis Charles, in March of 1785. She also had a baby girl, Sophie Beatrix, in July of 1786. She only lived for a year. And her mother died in 1780, never met any of her children. So by all accounts, Marie calmed down with motherhood. She adored her children and doted on them. She dressed more simply, spent far less money. But the damage to her reputation was already done, mostly. And, even at this point, it's possible that her reputation could have been salvaged. And maybe if she'd lived longer, she could have laundered her reputation. Maybe. Had it not been for the affair of the diamond necklace. Let me share a video about that incident.
By 1785, the Queen's image had grown so tarnished that no one believed her when she became the innocent victim of an outrageous swindle by a group of thieves with connections to Versailles. An elaborate diamond necklace was the prize.
Les joailliers de la couronne avaient constitué un collier de 2842 carats et avec des pierres d'une eau extraordinaire. Estimé aujourd'hui, disons que ça ferait 7 millions d'euros. Et ils ont essayé de le vendre dans toutes les cours d'Europe. Personne n'en voulait, c'était trop cher, ce bijou fabuleux.
They offered the necklace to the Queen, but tempting as it was, the price was too steep. She refused to buy it. Now, without the knowledge of the Queen or the jewelers, the swindlers made their first move. They concocted an elaborate scheme to lure a gullible clergyman into advancing money to buy the necklace for her. The most important clergyman in France, His Eminence, the Cardinal de Rohan. Ambitious, fatuous, the Cardinal was the dupe at the swindle's center.
Too rich, too stupid, too vain. A tiny brain the size of a flea.
The Queen detested him, rarely deigned to glance his way. But when the swindlers told him she wanted to meet in secret in the park at Versailles, he believed them. He would do anything to win her favor. That night, a woman dressed in white glided out of a grove of dark pines. Blinded by his desire to prove his devotion, the Cardinal was convinced it was the Queen herself. He never knew that the woman behind the broad-brimmed hat was a prostitute.
Maybe he's in love with her, maybe he's not. But he wants to be in her good graces.
The Cardinal bowed and kissed the hem of the prostitute's dress. You may now hope she said mysteriously, that the past will be forgotten. Then, fearing she would be found out, she fled. That was all. But it was enough to make the cardinal rapturous, convinced that he was now a favorite of the Queen. The swindle had begun.
It was such a kind of a cock-up, as we say in Britain, of such massive, mind-blowing proportions that words and thoughts fail us.
The swindlers told the cardinal that the Queen would be forever in his debt if he would buy the necklace for her. She would, they assured him, return his money later.
We think, how could he have possibly been taken in? We have to remember that he was desperate to get into the Queen's good graces, and when he was told this is what she'd like you to buy the necklace and then she'll pay you back, it fitted in with what he wanted to hear.
The cardinal bought the necklace and turned it over to the swindlers, who promised to deliver it to the Queen. It never reached her. The thieves made off with the diamonds, leaving the cardinal with nowhere to turn when the money came due. When the web of lies finally came unstrung, the Queen was outraged. The king summoned the cardinal to Versailles' splendid Hall of Mirrors, gave the orders for his arrest, and put him on trial, accused of conspiring to steal the necklace. The judges deliberated for 16 hours. The cardinal belonged to one of the greatest noble families in France. He was innocent, the judges ruled, without a stain upon his character. The Queen could not hide her sorrow. Although she was innocent, poisonous rumors had denounced her as the guilty party, who had coveted the necklace and had urged the cardinal to buy it for her. She wrote a friend,
"Come and weep with me. The judgment that has just been pronounced is an atrocious insult. I am bathed in tears of grief and despair."
This is really the story of a woman who has to grow up very fast, and she does so in fits and starts. There are various moments in her career where there is an incredible sobering up and wising up, and the aftermath of the affaire du collier, the diamond necklace affair, is one of those moments.
Marie Antoinette had been blameless, but the verdict was a ringing denunciation of her way of life.
I think the diamond necklace affair was made possible because Marie Antoinette was already seen as somebody who would do anything to get a new diamond. It's because Marie Antoinette was seen as a frivolous woman that the necklace affair could exist. The diamond necklace affair was a turning point for Marie Antoinette. She was condemned at that time, and she was condemned forever.
So, while the diamond necklace incident is often blamed for the revolution, there were actually multiple factors at play. France owed a huge national debt, and even the heavy taxes couldn't clear it. Not even modern-day economists would have been able to restore the fortunes of France. It was that bad. So how were they expecting a boy in his 20s who had lived at Versailles in privilege to know how to fix it? A successful revolution in America funded by France had resulted in independence for the people. And so the French people wanted the same thing. The Industrial Revolution had created a new professional class, and they were opposed to the laziness of the aristocracy and of the nobility. They demanded fair pay for a fair day's work. And then there was a notorious propagandist named Hebert. We'll talk about him in more detail later. because he played a pivotal role in Marie Antoinette's downfall. And also the people were literally starving to death because there had been a famine caused due to bad weather. And so in 1789, it finally began. So Marie Antoinette's first son, the Dauphin, he had developed tuberculosis and he died on June 4th, 1789. Louis Joseph was only 7 years old when he died. And he was buried on June 13th. At this time, the assembly of the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the common people was taking place. And so the devastated couple barely had time to even mourn him because the storming of the Bastille happened almost exactly 1 month later on the 14th of July. And so the Estate General meeting, that's basically a meeting with France's parliament, had met a few weeks earlier to find a solution to all the riots and all the political unrest that was taking place. And around this time, Louis XVI had concentrated troops around Paris. And the people were fearful that the king was going to crack down so that he could take over as an absolute monarch again. So I'm going to share a video about the storming of the Bastille. Pictures to share before that. This is some of the lovely handwork that was created by the propagandist above. That's Marie. That's another one. Here's another one. That's a portrait of Marie with her children. That's the Dauphin who died. That's her second one, Marie Charlotte. And this is Louis Charles. And then Lady Beatrix, who died, was left out of the painting. Anyway, so the video about the storming of the Bastille.
By July, 30,000 royal troops are taking position around Paris. To defend themselves, the people form a national guard. Les Invalides, the military hospital, is raided, and 28,000 muskets distributed. The only thing missing is gunpowder, but the people know just where to get it. Near the center of Paris, there looms a massive stone keep, an infamous symbol of tyrannical government, the Bastille. The prison houses the city's stores of gunpowder and is legendary as a place where enemies of the crown disappeared.
The Bastille had been the great symbol of royal despotism, the great symbol of the kings of France running beyond the just limits of their own power, a symbol of horror for the people of France.
Amidst the rioting, news spreads that Louis has sacked his finance minister, the people's beloved Jacques Necker. The court holds him responsible for the revolt of the Third Estate. To the people of Paris, it appears their enemies at court are striking back. On the 14th of July, crowds band together, identifying themselves with a rosette, red and blue for the colors of Paris, separated by white, the color of the House of Bourbon. The tricolor is born. From the feverish crowd, a voice cries out, "To the Bastille!"
Attacking the Bastille means that the people of Paris are saying, you cannot get rid of the new National Assembly. The people are acting, they're arming themselves, and they're basically saying, we take the side of the revolution.
The governor of the Bastille, the Marquis de Launay, tries to secure the prison when he learns of the approaching mob. He mounts a hopeless defense with only 32 guards. The marauders storm the fortress and tear into the soldiers with knives and pikes. Finally, Governor de Launay surrenders, but the enraged mob engulfs him, dragging him into the streets. The jeering horde kicks and stabs at him until his pleas for death are answered. Before the end of the day, the mayor of Paris will meet a similar fate. A revolutionary tradition is born. Delaunay's severed head is paraded on a pike to the delight of the crowd. Word of the bloody revolt quickly reaches the deputies at the National Assembly.
The deputies in the National Assembly do not immediately condemn this act of violence. In fact, they accept it. And it was this acceptance of popular violence that, in some people's view, created a pattern that was to have catastrophic consequences for the unfolding of the revolution.
With the smoke still clearing over the Bastille, Louis XVI returns from a hunting trip. In his diary, under the date 14th of July, 1789, he writes, "Nothing," a reference to his unsuccessful hunt. Then an aide brings news of the fall of the Bastille. "Is it a revolt?" asks the king. "No, sire," he is answered. "It is a revolution." The victory at the Bastille marks a crucial moment in French history. The people had defied their king and won. There would be no turning back. As a symbol of the defeat of oppression, the people dig with their bare hands and tear apart the Bastille brick by brick. They are beginning to dismantle the past itself.
The French went about the process of tearing down the Bastille as quickly as they could. In the absence of powerful explosives, this was done very painstakingly, but with a tremendous amount of vigor. And the bricks were given away, sold as emblems of the demolition of despotism.
The energy of the streets invigorates the National Assembly. A revolutionary manifesto is adopted, called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It calls for an end to tyranny and for a representative government to protect the freedom and equality of all men.
The Declaration of the Rights of Man was a declaration promulgated by the National Assembly, which said in its text that the sovereignty belongs to the people, it belongs to the nation. The king is nowhere mentioned in this document. Therefore, by issuing this document, the Assembly was effectively seizing power for itself.
With the new National Assembly as their voice, the people of France set out to change the very fabric of their world. They demand a constitutional monarchy, equal rights for all men, and justice under reasonable laws. Robespierre demands increased freedom for the press, which had been muzzled under the old regime.
And so after the storming of the Bastille, the bricks were kept as relics of freedom and were distributed all over France. Local militias formed that called themselves the National Guard. The middle class took over, and feudalism was abolished on August the 4th. And then on October 5th, a mob of women marched on Versailles, calling for Marie Antoinette's blood. So she came to the balcony at Versailles all alone and bravely faced them. They hurled insults at her for over 10 minutes. She said nothing. After they were done, she bowed and curtsied to them. And now this mob began to chant, "Vive la reine, long live the queen." Louis gave them food and promised to do his best. And some of them left. But for others, it wasn't enough. They stayed out there the entire night. And then the following day, they broke into Versailles and they actually rushed up to Marie's bedroom. They killed her guards and put their heads on pikes. Marie narrowly missed being killed. If they caught her, they'd have torn her to pieces. And the royal family was forced to move from Versailles back to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, which had been unoccupied since Louis XIV because he built Versailles. And so revolution spread from Paris to all other parts of France. And leaders of the National Assembly prepared the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So basically, there was going to be power sharing, and the king would no longer be an absolute ruler. Louis was a weak man and he would have gone along with it, but Marie was opposed to it privately. And so she wrote to the King of Spain and Austria asking for help. And numerous factions had formed amongst the people. There were the Jacobins, the Sans-Culottes, the Girondins, the Midorians, the Dantonists, the Eberists, many of them, each with its own idea of the direction that the country should take. Again, I don't want to delve too deep into this part of things, but most of the people just wanted a monarch who was democratic and, accountable, someone who would be answerable to the people. That's what they wanted. And so a compromise between the monarchy and the National Assembly was going to be negotiated, which would basically leave Louis XVI as a toothless monarch. And this was alien to his upbringing. So, well, I don't want to delve too deep into the revolution itself, but I want to talk about some notable people who were very notable for their roles in their downfall. So one of these was Jacques-René Hebert. He was a journalist or propagandist who ran a newspaper known as La Pierre du Chêne. And he is described as the Homer of filth by a French linguist, Ferdinand Bruno. He is responsible for the most vile and graphic pamphlets and the foul language used against Marie Antoinette. Like, the pamphlets he created are so vulgar. I'm not going to show them here. He called Marie Antoinette the monster that hell vomited onto earth. He made up all sorts of false stories about Marie Antoinette, about how promiscuous she was. I'm not sure even he believed what he was writing. He called Louis XVI a lazy, drunken, cuckolded pig. Charming. So he was one of Marie Antoinette's most violent opponents, and he poured fuel on the raging fires, particularly amongst the sans-culottes, the peasant class. And then, of course, there was Maximilien Robespierre, who famously refused to bow to the king during the meeting of the Estates General. He was a major leader of a revolution. He created a pamphlet that was known as The Enemies of the County Unmasked. He oversaw the September terrors that saw many people killed. He was a member of the Committee for Public Safety and also a member of the Jacobin Club, those who were wanting to have the monarchy completely abolished. So now let's talk about the flight to Varennes, which happened in 1791. So Marie and Louis noticed how much more radicalized the revolutionaries were getting, and they wanted out because they feared for their safety. And so, helped by Count Axel von Fersen, they hatched an escape plan. They would escape the Tuileries disguised as commoners. They would travel in ordinary carriages to a prearranged location where they would get transferred into a more luxurious carriage. And then they would travel to Montmedy, a royal stronghold in the north. And the plan worked. So they escaped on June 20th, 1791, and they made it to their luxury carriage. But this carriage was so heavy that it slowed their journey down. And they stopped for fresh horses 20 times. And one of the wheels of this luxury carriage got damaged, so they had to stop to get it fixed. I don't know, maybe because this journey was slow and Louis started getting careless because he wasn't hiding in the carriage as he should have. And so when they stopped at Saint Menehould for supplies, the postmaster of that town recognized Louis, recognized him from his resemblance on an assignat, a form of currency that they had. And so the postmaster rode ahead of their slow carriage and into the next town, Varennes, and he raised the alarm there. And so an ambush was laid for them. And so when they got there, they were captured and taken back to Paris. And now their reputation was in tatters, absolute tatters, because most of the support they still had amongst the people evaporated overnight. Louis lost all credibility as a constitutional monarch, and this was what paved the way for the escalated crises and subsequently for execution. So this time, they were watched day and night. Even when they were getting dressed, they were watched. They were truly in prison now, and they were regarded as traitors. At the same time, counter-revolutions were beginning because the surrounding monarchies were trying to aid them. On the 20th of April, 1792, Marie persuaded Louis to declare war on Austria. The idea was that if Austria won the war, then they would be saved. And so they got moved from the Tuileries to the Temple prison following a failed massacre. Well, it wasn't a failed massacre, but it was a massacre where there was an attempt to rescue them from the Tuileries Palace. So they were moved to the Temple prison. And then the monarchy was formally abolished on April the 21st of September, 1792. And that same year, on the 11th of December, Louis was indicted. Well, he was indicted as Louis Capet, even though his surname was actually Bourbon. It was a show trial, and so of course he was found guilty. And Robespierre declared that Louis had to die so that the country could live. And so Louis was sentenced to death. And his execution took place on January 21st, 1793. He was beheaded with the guillotine. Marie was inconsolable. She really got solace from her children, but that was about to change. On July 3rd, 1793, an order came that Louis Charles, the Dauphin, her son, was to be taken away from her. Mary refused to hand him over. Her little boy was kicking and screaming, crying when they came to take him away. And Marie physically fought off the guards and the officers. They threatened to bring up more guards and to use violence. She wouldn't stop. She fought them off. She told them to just kill her because that's the only way they were going to get her son. But she gave in because they threatened to kill her children. And make no mistake, they would have killed them. They would have killed those children. They had killed the king. They would have killed them. She really was a wonderful mother. She loved her children. She never saw her children again. And then, after her son was taken from her, her best friend was brutally killed shortly afterwards. Her best friend was the Princess de Lamballe, Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy, a quiet, loving, and kind woman. She was a member of the Savoy Carignano Cadet branch of the House of Savoy, belonged to the Italian royal families. Grew up in Italy, very well educated, a polyglot who enjoyed reading particularly Italian poetry. She married into the richest family in France. She was widowed at age 21. She was nicknamed the Good Angel of Penthièvre. She never remarried. She stayed on, and she dedicated her life to charity, and she looked after the poor all her life. But her closeness to Marie Antoinette was her undoing. But she'd even been accused of being Marie Antoinette's lesbian lover. And so in 1791, she had escaped to England and she tried to get help for Marie's family. She was received by the Queen and King of England, but the King refused to help. So the Princess de Lamballe was warned in a letter by King Louis not to return to France. But she did. She came back, claiming that Marie needed her and that she must live or die at the side of Marie Antoinette. And so when she returned to Paris, she was arrested and she was accused of being sympathetic to Austria. Then in 1792, when the monarchy was officially abolished, she was locked up at the Temple prison along with Marie. So she was ordered to swear an oath denouncing the monarchy and denouncing her friendship with Marie Antoinette. She refused. So on September 3rd, 1792, she was dragged outside the prison and handed over to an angry mob where she was beaten up, raped, mutilated until she was unrecognizable, and then she was beheaded. And her head was put onto a pike and paraded outside Marie Antoinette's prison window. Marie saw her head and fainted. She was killed at the age of 42. And now next, Marie was in the crosshairs. She was coming up next. So the death of the Austrian she-wolf was demanded by all. She never stood a chance. She was a scapegoat and they wanted to make an example of her. So Robespierre and his allies knew that the armies of the neighboring monarchies, namely Austria and Prussia, were approaching. And these armies had lots of monarchists in their ranks. And yet there was a lot of anger from the French people, and the extremist revolutionaries saw this as their opportunity. So August 1st, 1793, Marie Antoinette was formally indicted and accused of conspiring against France. She was no longer a queen. She was a widow capet. And so she was transferred to the conciergerie, the Revolutionary Tribunal prison. So rather than just lynching people directly, they held show trials. She was heavily guarded. And there was Fouquier, a prosecutor for the Republic. He had been waiting for this moment, but Robespierre was reluctant. He didn't really want to kill Marie. However, the propagandist was still fueling the fires of hate for her with his news pamphlets. And Fouquier encouraged him to go even further, and it worked because he stirred the pot so much. The citizens were sending in letters now demanding Marie Antoinette's death. And so Robespierre caved because he knew if he didn't give the people what they wanted, their rage at her could get transferred onto him. And so on the night of September 2nd, 1793, all the topmost dignitaries of the Republic held a secret meeting where it was decided that Marie Antoinette was going to be put on trial. But the jurors were not going to be randomly selected. They couldn't leave it to chance. She had to die. She had to be made an example of. And so they were going to handpick the 15 jurors. So her trial commenced on October 14th, 1793, with a 15-man jury, all of them handpicked, and they were amongst the most reliable loyalists of the revolution. These men were going to vote for the death penalty, regardless of how the trial unfolded. These men were bona fide sans-culotte members. They had participated in the Great Terrors. They'd benefited greatly from the revolution. They comprised mostly of shopkeepers and craftsmen. So Marie Antoinette's lawyers were appointed only the day before the trial, and they met with her for just 1 hour. Even the indictment document was riddled with insults lifted directly from the propaganda pamphlets. She was accused of spending France's money on Austria, and correspondence with the enemies of France was brought, even though there were letters that she simply written to her brother, the Emperor of Austria. She never actually sent money home, but she had sent her jewels home to Austria in 1791 for safekeeping. So there was outlandish testimony from 41 different witnesses, but there was still a lack of evidence, even though there were 41 witnesses. The former Marquis de Gouvernet, who had served as her husband's Minister of War, was called in as a witness, and he tried his utmost to defend Marie, but his testimony was falsified to fit in with the narrative of the revolutionaries, and so he was beheaded within months of his testimony. And I have to state that Marie indeed sent secret correspondence to Austria about official French affairs. But this was normal for a foreign princess to do, because evidence of this was uncovered after her trial, showing that she had in fact sent these letters. But she lied to protect the monarchy. But so what if she lied? So did her accusers. So on day 2, October 15th, 1793, Jacques René Aubert, the propagandist, he gave testimony that Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, had had an incestuous relationship with his mother. This must have been very painful to hear for Marie Antoinette. But this fake charge had a twofold purpose, because not only was it supposed to discredit her, if somehow they ever took the throne again, it would always be whispered behind their backs that they'd had an incestuous relationships. It was incredibly damaging to the monarchy. Remember that her son, Louis Charles, was 7 years old, right? This boy had been born into unimaginable wealth and privilege. Now he was living with a cobbler who beat him up regularly. They could have made him say and do anything they wanted. They killed his father. How terrified do you think he was? He was 7 years old, and yet they interrogated him and made him sign the document. And so when this accusation was leveled at Marie, she didn't even respond until the women from the gallery who were watching were asking her if she wouldn't respond. And so she finally said, "I did not respond because such a charge leveled at a mother goes against nature. I appeal to all the mothers here." And surprisingly, the women watching from the public gallery, they began to rally to her side now and support her. This was a bit of a turning point during her trial, because it was at this point that they realized that it was just a ruse, just a mockery of the trial. We now know that Marie had cancer and was experiencing significant blood loss at the time of her trial. But she answered her questions precisely. She maintained her dignity and her majesty throughout her trial. She never expected to be killed. She thought she was going to get deported back to Austria. But Austria didn't do much to save her. She was a defeated, deposed ex-queen, tarnished by the revolution, used up, and she would have only been an embarrassment to her family if she'd been released. She was no longer a useful political pawn. They couldn't marry her out to another royal house. The monarchy is a society built on pride and honor. She had none left. Her lawyers were both arrested in the courtroom during her trial on some trumped up charges. And the jury
deliberated for less than an hour before the unanimous death sentence came down, and was to be carried out on that same day, October 16th at 11 a.m. I'm going to play a video about her execution, and then we'll talk some more afterwards.
Now, with only hours to live, Marie Antoinette prepared for her final ordeal. Weak and exhausted, she summoned her remaining strength to write her sister-in-law.
October 16th, 4:30 in the morning. I have just been condemned to death, but not to a shameful one, since this death is shameful only to criminals. I am calm, as people are, whose conscience is clear. I know how much my little boy must have made you suffer. Forgive him, my dear sister. Remember how young he is, and how easy it is to make a child say whatever one wants, to put words he does not understand into his mouth. I send you my heartfelt love, and also to my poor, dear children. How heartbreaking it is to leave them forever. Adieu. Adieu.
The letter ends abruptly. It was never sent. As the tumbril made its way across Paris, the horses walked slowly. Marie Antoinette, one revolutionary said, should drink long of death. 30,000 soldiers stood guard. Mobs lined the streets, hurling insults. The whore, one newspaper reported, was audacious and insolent to the very end.
Her dignity was so great that when she was taken in this rough cart, no carriage for her, to the place of execution, the newspapers dared not write afterwards that she'd been cowardly, that she'd shrieked and cried, as they liked writing about aristocrats. They had to say that she'd been dignified. So they said it was the pride of a habitual criminal.
Il y a un crayon de David qui montre une très vieille femme que l'on conduit à la guillotine avec un courage extraordinaire et une dignité incroyable.
She showed no sign of fear. Some people achieve miracles of decent self-control and composure.
At that moment, which must be an incredible moment of panic, she still reflects perfect form. She climbed the stairs to the guillotine very lightly, without a pause. A sort of natural heroism. She did die as a queen.
It was noon. With the blade suspended above her, Marie Antoinette moved forward and accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot.
Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose.
Marie Antoinette's severed head was held high before a screaming crowd. She was buried in an unmarked grave.
Ce qui la place véritablement dans la légende, c'est cette mort affreuse. Il y a mythe parce que c'était une femme frivole qui s'est transformée bien malgré elle et parce que sa vie s'est achevée par une abominable tragédie.
She's gone on a very long journey through hell and back. And with each defeat and each disaster, behave with transcendence, courage. But as a queen, she is a catastrophe because she makes a constitutional monarchy impossible. A relatively peaceful transition from an old world of an absolute monarchy to a new world of a constitutional monarchy is screwed. That door is closed. All of our own natural, humane response to her being someone who behaves with a growing sense of tragic intelligence does not compensate. It's tragedy for France, but it's also, in a Greek sense, of tragedy being no way out, of playing out your destiny. It is indeed deeply a personal tragedy.
It's a story which goes between two extremes. She was a girl whose destiny is the happiest possible destiny. All she wanted and all she created was made from flowers and sounds. It's a vanishing kingdom. By the end, everything she had is taken away from her. Everything and everybody she loved.
There's something poignant she said during her trial. I was a queen, and you took away my crown. A wife, and you killed my husband. A mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long. And also, when she was stepping up to the guillotine to get her head lopped off, there was a priest standing next to her, and he whispered to her, "Courage, madame." To which she responded, "Courage. I have shown it for years. Think you I shall lose it at the moment of my suffering, about to end?" After the murder, her head was placed between her legs, and her body was buried in a mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery. She may have been a frivolous and shallow woman in her youth, but she faced her persecution and execution like a champion. She died a queen. I love this picture of her. And if it's any consolation, Robespierre, most of the jurors, Fouquier, and even Hebert, the propagandist, they all died the same way she died. None of them showed even an ounce of her dignity. They were dragged, kicking and screaming to their deaths. So Marie's trial was not just aimed at her. It showed a generalized scorn for women who needed to know their place. In a way, the revolution was also a form of political revenge against women, because by a decree of the National Convention, women's clubs were closed within days of her execution. One of the saddest things that happened, in my opinion, like after this whole execution, was what happened to her son, Louis Charles. So his 7-year-old brother, the Dauphin, Louis Joseph, had died in 1789, right? From tuberculosis. And so he became the new Dauphin at age 4, just a few weeks before the French Revolution started. And so from
age 4 on, he was imprisoned, and he never left captivity. He was branded the son of a tyrant, and he was locked up along with his family at the Temple prison in 1792. He was never freed. There he is. So his father was executed January 21st, 1793. And then he was taken away from his mother that same year, right? July 3rd, placed in the custody of a cruel cobbler named Antoine Simon and his wife, Marie Jeanne. Rumored that he was severely abused and beaten and molested in their care. He was re-educated as a Republican and made to renounce his family name. He was manipulated into accusing his mother and his aunt of sexually abusing him. And so after he testified against his mother, he was locked up in solitary confinement for the rest of his life. And he was fed through a hatch in the door. His cell was never cleaned, ever. So he lived with his bodily waste all around him. He lost his power of speech. And whenever he was fed, he would eat a bit of the food and leave most of it for the rats, so they would leave him alone. His jailers beat him up repeatedly, and his sister would hear him screaming from his cell. He was useless to them after testifying against his mother. They just left him to die there, totally diminished his little boy who'd grown up in the palace doing Latin conjugation. He turned into a gutter snipe, locked away in his filth, and he died before he was 10 years old. Died alone. And I want to talk about some of Marie Antoinette's good qualities, which we do not even know about. It's sad how the good she did is totally overlooked. She dedicated a lot of resources to helping the poor. She founded a home for unwed single mothers. She visited and gave food to poor families. During the 1787 famine, she sold off some of the royal cutlery sets, and she used the proceeds to buy grain for people in need. She loved children, and she even adopted several children from poor families. One of her maids died, and she adopted the maid's child. She had a very soft spot for children, for orphans especially. And every time she heard that children had lost their parents, she would immediately say, I adopt them. And she treated all these orphans like they were her own. First child she adopted was named Armand, and she adopted him in 1776, before she even had her own children. He was almost run over by a carriage when he was 4 or 5 years old, and she found out he was an orphan, so she took him to the palace to live with them. His birth name was Francois Michel, but she renamed him Armand. Sadly, he was a teenager when the revolution started, and he turned against the family. The ungrateful twerp. And then the second one she adopted was the child of her maid. She was born Marie Philippine Lambriquet. At this time, Marie had given birth, but she wanted normal, non-aristocratic playmates for her children. And so this girl would play with Marie Antoinette's daughter. The girl was orphaned, and Marie fully adopted her. Marie insisted that the girls be treated exactly the same. Marie renamed this one Ernestine. And the third child she adopted was a little Senegalese boy. Yes, he was black. Marie looked after him until her execution. His name was Jean Amilcar. And after her execution, he was thrown on the streets, and he died on the streets. And the fourth child she adopted was a 3-year-old girl named Jean-Louise Victoire. She was a playmate for the new Dauphin. Marie renamed her Zoe. And Marie also introduced the croissant to France. I grew up thinking the croissant was French when it's actually an Austrian snack. She made the career of Elizabeth Vigny-Lebrun, the female portraitist who made over 30 portraits of Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was also patron to the Maison Philanthropique, which looked after the blind, the elderly, and the widowed. She even tried to have a mixed-race man named Chevalier Saint-Georges. This man was nicknamed the Black Mozart. He was that good a violinist. And Marie tried to have him appointed as the director of the Paris Opera, but it was only scuttled because of his race. So she was a very progressive person, and she did a lot of good that we don't hear about. You know, I grew up learning about this frivolous, spoiled brat. And yet when I learned more about this, I actually felt sorry for her. So, you know, there's a lot more to Marie Antoinette than let them eat cake. Well, thus ended the lesson. I hope you enjoyed this and see you at the next one. Thank you. Ciao.